So now that we have an idea of the threats facing our community, as well as the vulnerabilities across the physical, social, and economic realms, we need to bring it all together and come up with a plan to mitigate those vulnerabilities and build resilience within our communities. So once we've done our baseline analysis, we've identified threats, we've identified vulnerabilities, it's time to start putting that together and look to the trends analysis. This is actually where we look into the future to start identifying those patterns of change in our community that might affect um, our vulnerabilities as well as the threats that our community is facing. So that may be things like unsustainable development patterns, where we're seeing that we're building into more vulnerable areas. We're seeing that we're creating more impervious surfaces that are increasing drainage issues and flooding. All of those things are part of the changing conditions that we need to be aware of so we can start to plan for them. We can start to change behaviors that are maybe increasing our vulnerabilities or our potential risks. And that trends analysis is the guide to do that. So we need to identify goals. As with any planning effort, having goals is an important part of the process to make sure that we are prioritizing actions that can be taken to mitigate vulnerabilities and address the threats that our community face. We want to think about long term about adaptation, how we can build differently, how we can more effectively protect natural resources and ecosystem services, right? Move away from that focus on mechanical or engineering solutions, look to more naturalistic and environmental solutions that are going to be more sustainable for the long term. And we need to take that understanding that resilience is about adaptability, diversity, and holistic thinking. It's not looking at one solution to solve our problems. It's looking at a systems approach, a systems thinking approach that can help us be more sustainable and more resilient for the long run. So some examples of resilience thinking are building economic diversity, recognizing that a dependence on a single economic driver for our community is not sustainable. It's not resilience. It's that single point of failure that we've talked about. So things like supporting local entrepreneurs, recruiting and retaining a variety of businesses, making sure we have an understanding of what their needs and concerns are, how we can more effectively support them in the event of a disaster. We want to look to our ordinances and our regulations. Are they a barrier to resilient planning and development? Are they an issue? So if we have very strict zoning codes, are we actually pushing people out to more vulnerable parts of our county or our region because we're not allowing good development within our city limits? We want to make sure we're protecting our natural systems and those ecosystem services, things like preserving wetlands, preserving barrier islands, not building in vulnerable areas, making sure that those can serve their purpose of absorbing hazards and reducing the threat to our communities through the natural services that they provide. Things like low impact development standards, we'll talk about more about those in a future course on flooding, but low impact development standards are a way of dealing with drainage and stormwater issues that's more efficient and more effective than our conventional engineering approach. And we want to think about building community. We want to make sure we have ongoing communication and outreach to our residents. We want to make sure we're building trust and relationships, establishing those networks across our community, building capacity within the individuals in our communities, as well as organizations and community groups that can be such an effective part of the response to disaster when it strikes. So lots of people are part of this process. It's not just planners, it's not just emergency management, it's not just public safety. We need to make sure that we're bringing in all parts of local government to be part of this planning effort. Community development, public works, emergency response, the building department, all of these different parts of our local government have expertise and knowledge that can be part of reducing vulnerabilities and addressing the challenges that our communities face. It's also about establishing relationships outside of your jurisdiction, working with county, state, and federal officials to make sure you have those open lines of communication. So when a disaster strikes, you can pick up the phone and know who to call and how to get the resources that your community might need. And it's about working with your citizens, your businesses, and your local organizations, making sure they're aware of what's being done in terms of hazards planning, reducing vulnerabilities and the like, making sure that you're aware of the resources and the capacities that they can bring to the conversation and how they can help in the event of a disaster. So again, we're using all the resources of our community in a response, not just looking to government to solve all the problems, but recognizing that the local grocery store can be an enormous resource in helping to get food where it's needed to people. Local companies like Tide can have public service arms of their companies where they, I think Tide brings in tractor trailer trucks full of washing machines and dryers that people can come and do their laundry. If we're thinking about people who've lost their homes, maybe they escaped from a wildfire with the clothes on their back, having access to a laundry can be a big deal for them, right? So that's a solution that can be provided by not government. And I think that's an important thing to remember. And it's an important part of the resilience planning effort to bring in those other resources and make sure that everyone's aware of what capacity other organizations can bring to the table. And it's about seeing the big picture, right? We've talked about identifying potential threats and vulnerabilities, recognizing the realities of our community, not having a rose-colored glasses when we look at our communities, recognizing that we do face challenges and we need to accept those challenges and address those challenges if we're going to build resiliency. We need to think about our community preparedness. How aware are people within the community of the threats that our communities face? We need to think about building local institutions and how, again, we can look to other organizations than just government to help solve problems. Government can focus on those infrastructure and facility vulnerabilities, reducing their potential threat from hazards and making sure they're going to be resilient and withstand whatever threats are maybe thrown at them. We need to think about networks and relationships. I've talked a lot about that. Make sure we're identifying opportunities and emerging changing conditions that we need to incorporate into our planning. And we need to think about environmental improvement. So looking at the natural environment around our communities, how we can better manage that to make it more effective in serving and providing those ecosystem services that our communities depend on. And finally, there's an opportunity to craft a new image for the community. This can be especially useful when a major disaster is struck and a community is looking to rebuild and recover from that disaster. There can be an opportunity to create a new idea of what that community is going to be going forward. I've talked about the desire among many people when struck by a tragedy or a disaster, they want to return to what was there before, right? Rebuild the same as it was. But the idea of resilience is, again, about thinking differently, about creating new opportunities and communities that are going to be more sustainable going forward and less vulnerable to future hazards. So I love this quote from Winston Churchill. Just gives you an idea that resilience planning is not an end to itself. Conditions are always changing. Our communities are always changing. So understanding the threats that we face is not a static situation. Or threats are going to evolve, conditions are going to evolve. So having a resilience plan in place is just the starting point. As we work through the plan, as we begin to address the goals and the objectives that we've identified within our plan, we need to recognize that things are always changing around us, and our plan is going to have to adapt to those changing conditions if we want it to truly be a guide for the future and provide us with the direction and the decision-making tool that we need to be successful in building resilient communities.